Hi, this is Gary Habermas. I'm the Distinguished Research Professor of Apologetics and Philosophy at Liberty University in Lynchburg, Virginia. I teach full-time in the PhD program here, and I have been a guest on the program by Nick Peters on many occasions, and over the years I've noticed how many excellent guests he gets. And I can tell you personally that Nick reads everything that comes his way. He's a great interviewer. He's got good insight and questions, and I highly recommend his program.
You stand on the shore of the ocean watching the tide come in. You sense the call of the sea beckoning to take you further. You step forward little by little, not knowing what to expect, but expecting more. You keep going as the ocean calls you to enter in to deep waters.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Deeper Waters podcast. I am Nick Peters, your host, seeking to bring you the very best in Christian scholarship and apologetics. And today, like all the other days, is no exception. I'm going to be talking today about who Jesus is in the book of Colossians. Now, this is a little book in your New Testament, one of the disputed Pauline epistles, although there are some who do think Paul did write it. I'm sure we'll be looking at that some. But what does it say about Jesus? I mean, don't the Jehovah's Witnesses love to come to us with that little passage that says, he is the firstborn of all creation? And well, there you have it. Jesus is part of creation. What else can we learn about who Jesus is from Colossians? To discuss this, I'm joined with someone who did, I believe, his PhD in this area, and that's Matt Delockery. He earned his bachelor's degree in business from the Georgia Institute of Technology, his master's in divinity from Luther Rice University, and his PhD in New Testament from Radboud, Nijmegen, and I hope I pronounced that correct. He is the founder and president of the apologetics ministry Why Should I Believe, which has chapters at Georgia Tech and Cornell. You can find his podcast and blog at mattdelockery.com. So, Dr. Delockery, welcome to the Deeper Waters podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Now, if my audience doesn't know much about who you are, can you tell us a bit about how you got to be doing what you're doing?
Well, it started a long time ago when I was actually growing up in church. My parents took me from the time that I was young, and I just thought that's always what you were supposed to do. When I was about 13 or so, I got really interested in finding more out about Christianity, and I tried to do that through the church. Basically, by the time I was 18, I gave up with that. It's like, okay, I'm looking for Christianity, but I can't find it here. So since that time, I was still a Christian. I was just very disappointed in the sort of answers that I got from church about what Christianity actually was. That led to a long process that went through having a spiritual mentor while I was at Georgia Tech, which I think is the real reason God sent me there. And, then I went through seminary, had an apologetics class, which I hated. It wasn't very good at all. I actually found out about apologetics through another way and discovered something that I've been looking for a long time. It's like, okay, finally, here are people who are using reason and evidence to try to understand their faith. That's what I've been looking for the last 10 years. It really shouldn't have been this hard to find. And so that carried on and led me to do two things. One was to do a PhD in New Testament to find some answers for what I've been looking for all along, which is, what is Christianity? And the other is to start an apologetics ministry called Why Should I Believe, to try to help share some of those answers that I found with other people. So that's sort of a brief summary of what's been going on for the last 20 some odd years. Well, I think there's a lot of different answers that you get from different places, but I don't think it's any surprise that there's a lot of churches where things are just sort of a surface level sort of thing, and it's people go and they it's like they attach they put a Christian sticker on things, and it's not really Christianity. It's just sort of like, it's more social and more cultural than it actually is something that people live their lives by. So, I mean, if somebody's actually looking for the real thing, it's not hard to tell that, that's just a cheap knockoff, and you want something that's deeper, something that's a little better. And I wasn't really finding that. So that's what disappointed me with the answers that I was getting.
I have to sadly agree with you. I find many churches to be thoroughly boring just because there's not really any challenge there whatsoever. It seems more like a social club. We all go and we hear how to feel good. We sing songs that we don't really believe because they talk about Jesus being our everything and such, and people don't really live that out too well. And then every sermon is pretty much pure application about how to be a good person.
Yeah, it's like, if Jesus really is your everything, the rest of your life would look different than it does. So it seems a little like there's a disconnect between what you're singing and what you're living, and that's bothersome to me.
I was also surprised about going to seminary and taking an apologetics class and finding it boring.
Yeah, it was boring. I mean, you can do apologetics well, and you can do it, not so well. I mean, it was mostly like, here's some facts about some things, and let's talk about it. It just wasn't that interesting. There's it was around that time, I think it was maybe like a year later, I actually took a class on worldviews and origins, and I had a professor who had a master's in biology before he decided to get his PhD in theology. And so he's like, all right, we're going to talk about evolution, and we're going to do this from a biological perspective. And one of our course textbooks was a college biology textbook. Says, oh, let's get into the biology and let's talk about it. I'm like, okay, here we go. Finally, let's not just say, well, the Bible says that God created everything and we're done now. It's like, all right, well, what does the science say? If we're going to be saying that science is this or science is not, what's the data? And so that's where I actually discovered apologetics, and that's where it started to actually like become real to me, and discover that there's this whole field out there where people use reason and evidence and logic and try to understand their faith for more than, just that surface level.
I also think it was something interesting about having you on my show here, is that this is one of the rare times that I was on your show before you were on my show. Yeah.
Nice.
For those who don't know, Matt actually interviewed me last month for Autism Awareness Month, and I have actually been to speak at Why Should I Believe on the same topic.
You have, and so that went really well. So I was sort of like, well, I want to get this on my podcast too. So then I'm like, hey, can I interview you?
Yeah. Now, today we're talking about the book of Colossians. Now, what was it that got you interested in Colossians so much?
Well, I was looking for an answer to the question, what is Christianity? And I was talking with my advisor, and he was basically like, Matt, there are two letters where Paul gives his theology. He had a Dutch accent, so every time that I think of something that he says, I always do it in a Dutch accent. There's Romans and Colossians. You are just a PhD student. Romans is too big for you. Colossians, 95 verses. That's more your size. And so really it was sort of like, well, between the two, Romans isn't really an option because honestly, I'm just a beginner and it's just too much to tackle. And he was right. There's no question about that. But honestly, as I got into the letter, I discovered, you know what, Romans is not the best place to look for this. It really is in Colossians, even though the letter's authorship is disputed. Because what I was looking for was not Christian theology as such. It's not like the center of all Christian thought, of all Christian theology. What I was actually looking for is more of what we would call a Christian worldview. Sort of like just the basics, just the essence. Like if you were to put Christianity up next to atheism, Islam, Judaism, Buddhism, something like that, how would those two compare? How would Christianity and Islam or atheism compare? What are their central aspects of what makes each what it is? And Colossians really explains that better, I think, than any other letter, including Romans. does. So I think it is the best place to look for a Christian worldview.
Those are pretty strong claims. On this show, we're going to put you to a test and see if you can back them.
Yeah, I'll be happy to explain further why I think that if you want. I understand exactly what I'm saying. And I expected a lot of pushback from both my manuscript and my defense committee, and I actually didn't get it. I actually didn't get it that much. A little surprising, but.
Well, let's talk some about the authorship of Colossians. I know it's not your main focus, but you had to look at it some, I'm sure.
Oh, yeah.
So who do you think wrote it and why?
Short answer, Timothy under the supervision of Paul. There's a lot of arguments, or should I say, most of the arguments against Paul being the primary author center around that there's differences in theology, there's differences in style, there's differences of vocabulary, and so forth. And I don't think that's really disputed. The people who say that Paul's the author don't say that that's wrong. They would just claim that, well, he could write it different ways in different times, for different purposes. But I don't think we necessarily have to say that. So if you look at the letter itself, there's evidence to suggest that Paul was not the only real author, or possibly even the primary author. It says in verse 1 that Timothy is his co-author, Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ Jesus by the will of God, and Timothy, our brother. But what's interesting is what happens in verse 3. He uses the first person plural. He says, we thank God, we heard of your faith, and so on and so forth. When you compare it to 1 Corinthians, there's a similar opening, but something different happens. It says in verse 1, Paul and Sosthenes, but when you jump down to verse 4, Paul switches to the first person singular and says, I thank you, I do this, and so forth. Possibly indicating that Sosthenes is just sort of like an honorary co-author. Like, Paul's really writing this, but Sosthenes is like, yeah, he's here too, and he attaches his name to this. But in Colossians, Timothy is actually included in there. We thank God, we heard of your faith, and so on and so forth. And then when you consider the fact that at the end of the letter has, Paul, signing his own name and stuff like that, and then you add in the differences of vocabulary, I think what may have happened was, as you know, Paul discipled Timothy and was training him, and it could very well be that a part of that training was training in letter writing. So I don't think it'd be hard to imagine Paul saying to Timothy, all right, you've been doing pretty well. You've got your theology, together pretty well. Let's see how you do keeping up with churches. Let's see how you do writing a letter. Try writing a letter, and let me see what you do. Address the situation in Colossae. And so Timothy writes a letter, and then Paul is like, okay, well, most of that's pretty good. You need to change this here. You need to change that there and fix it up. And he goes through an editing process, sort of like a professor and his graduate TA might do, one of the people that is studying under him. And so Timothy is responsible for probably putting most of the letter together, I would think, though it was supervised by Paul. However, I still will call the letter Pauline, and when I talk or write about it, I'll still refer to Paul as the primary authority behind it. And so I still think it is a Pauline letter because Timothy would have gotten his theology from Paul. Timothy was trained by Paul, and Paul was still signed off on the letter and said, I'm okay with all this. So I think it does still investigate Paul's theology because he wouldn't have signed off on it if he didn't say that, I'm okay with everything that's in there. So I think Timothy wrote it under the supervision of Paul, but because of where Timothy got his information from and because Paul actually was involved in the process of putting the letter together, we can still call it Pauline and still use it as a way to understand what Paul actually thought. I didn't get into the date that much because mostly the question was, is Paul still alive or not? And as long as he's still alive, then standard Pauline dates for when he was alive and when it would have been written are fine. If not, then it would have been later. Most of the questions as far as like the meaning of the letter don't revolve around the date so much.
Wasn't it the case that Colossae was hit by a major earthquake sometime around that time, Bo?
It was. That happened. I can't remember off the top of my head, but it was. Well, Paul was in prison when he was writing this. He talks about the Colossians remembering his chains towards the end of chapter 1 and a little bit in the beginning of chapter 2. But again, that's not something that I got into that much in my research. Just I need to know the authorship question, but after that, it was strictly focused on what does the letter actually say? What does it mean?
Okay, now you said that in your thinking, Paul is saying to Timothy, okay, you're doing good theology, so try and you write a letter in deal with the Colossae situation. What was the situation?
Well, the situation was there was this group of philosophers, is what he calls them, this alternative philosophy that was there, and some of the Colossians were in danger of being led astray by it. Now, it wasn't so bad as was going on in Galatia, where they totally left the faith and they'd gone down a different path, and he was super angry with them. It was more like a warning: hey, don't do this. You haven't done it yet, but don't do this. Don't be led astray. And so this is why I think that Colossians is the best place to look for Christian worldview, because what Paul actually is doing here is comparing Christianity to this other philosophy and explaining why Christianity is better. So you get an actual comparison of Christianity with another worldview, which is another one of the reasons I think this is a better place to look for a Christian worldview than Romans, because it's actually being compared to another worldview. You don't get that in Romans. And in doing that, you can get a little bit at the question of why does Paul think Christianity is better? Because he does put the two up next to each other.
Mm-hmm. Now, you talk about this situation that was going on. How do we know this is what was going on?
You mean, are you asking, is there external evidence suggesting that?
What evidence leads us to think that this was what was going on?
Mostly just the letter. There's not a lot of external evidence suggesting one thing or another. The problem is identifying what the actual philosophy was. I mean, scholars are really sort of stuck on that. There's been guesses. It used to be for a long time that it was some sort of Gnosticism. People thought that's what it'd be. That was more popular, some decades ago. Now scholars are leaning a little bit more towards it as a Jewish mysticism. But the problem is there's not really anything external to the letter to be able to figure out what is this actually attached to. So you pretty much have to just go from what the letter itself says. And Paul describes the philosophy some, but not in as much detail as we would really like.
Now, you mentioned that it's not Gnosticism because that was popular a few decades ago to think that it's my understanding that full-blown Gnosticism wasn't even a reality yet.
Right. It wasn't. It was the people who say that are thinking that it's some sort of proto-Gnosticism, that it was getting going or something like that, and this was an early version of it. Probably another thing that's related to the difficulty that we have on identifying this is that it's probably some sort of a local philosophy or local worldview. It's not something that was widespread. Paul actually makes claims in the letter about Christianity being spread throughout the entire world, which is sort of a knock against them, saying, okay, well, this is a worldwide thing. The one that you're in danger of being led astray by is not. So which one do you think actually comes from the true God? And so because of that, it's probably something that's just a local variation in that area that we're dealing with. So it makes it a little bit harder to identify exactly what's going on.
One of the things we should probably explain also for those who don't know, since we're talking about Gnosticism and proto-Gnosticism, is what exactly do we mean by Gnosticism anyway?
Well, that gets a little bit beyond what I can answer, because I'm not a Gnosticism expert. I can say a few things on there, but I can't speak with great authority.
Okay. Well, just give us a few things. If you get someone listening who says, I've never heard this term Gnosticism, what do you have in mind when you say Gnosticism?
You put me on the spot there. Well, you're talking about people who are looking for sort of a secret knowledge about things, because Gnosticism comes from the Greek word gnosis, and the idea was that there's some secret knowledge that you need to have that will be able to lead you into salvation, that the average person doesn't have, and there'll be some similarities with other like mystery cults and things like that. There's secret knowledge that you need to be given from the people who have the power to do that, and so on and so forth. So the danger with that, and as it relates to the letter, is it's not Gnosticism, but why Christianity has had problems with that is because it's saying, okay, you need something other than Christ to be able to get you to where you're trying to go. And Christian response is, no, you don't need anything like that. It's, Christ alone.
And you had the whole thing also that some of them thought the Old Testament God was an evil God, and such, the material world's evil, things like that.
Old Testament evil God, which you hear that sort of thing coming out of Christians a lot of times that don't really know what they're talking about. Is like the Old Testament God was evil, the New Testament God was loving. It's like, no, that's not true.
Okay, so now let's get to your area of expertise here, because you're sitting down, you're reading Colossians, and I don't know what you're expecting, because odds are you've probably read this book several times before. What are you noticing that you hadn't noticed before that's surprising you?
Well, the biggest thing that if you're just looking at it the first time, you've read through the letter maybe a few times, and okay, I see all these things. Probably the biggest thing that I would think that people should notice that maybe don't is that there's a hymn in chapter 1. Verses 15 to 20 is actually a Christological hymn. When I say hymn, don't think of like, a hymn book or hymnal and that sort of thing. Think more of a creed, like the Apostles' Creed or the Nicene Creed. And the problem is, and I've said this before and I'll continue saying it, I really like translations. I think they do a really good job, but sometimes they do too good of a job and they make it really, really smooth, and you sort of gloss over this. And you think, oh, there's some really nice words about Jesus there in chapter 1. And the problem is you just glance over this. It's the theological foundation for the entire letter. And since Paul is explaining what the Christian worldview is, it is a theological foundation for the Christian worldview. So you can't just skip verses 15 to 20. You need to stop. They're in Greek, they're meant to be choppy. You're meant to slow down and read through them methodically. And every single word and every single phrase in the thing carries a lot of meaning. And that's something that people tend to miss when they just read through the letter, and really shouldn't. I really wish translations would just separate that out, break it down, show some of the structure, and force you to stop and pay attention to it. So that's something that should jump out at you and should make you pay a lot of attention. And then just generally, like in chapter 2, there's an explanation against the other philosophy, especially you've got a main thematic statement in verses 6 to 7. It says sort of the main points Paul is going to cover in the rest of the letter, and then you have explanation following that of what Christ has done, why the other philosophy is wrong. And then chapter 3 is, how you're supposed to live this out. And so you have this transition from theology to practice, and there's a connecting of beliefs and actions in the letter that is really, really important, that the two are not separate. And Paul in this letter shows very, very clearly how actions actually follow from the very particular theology that he's laying out. So because Christ is this, therefore you have to live like this, and he connects the dots all the way between the two. And that's, I think, one of the main features of the letter that's not easy to find unless you spend some time studying it.
I wanted to ask you something about the human creed, but I'd like to comment on what you just said first off, because it sounds like you're actually saying that Paul is, giving you good theology first, and then saying, here's the difference that theology makes. And I can't but think of a contrast with what I was just telling you about going to church services and just hearing sermons that are purely application and nothing more. Could it be maybe we should I'm sorry, I'm speaking out of turn here so much, but maybe we should actually be like Paul and give the theology first.
Well, yeah, because I mean, I completely agree with that. It's the why. People say, well, it's I just want what's relevant for my daily life. Well, how do you know that this is the right direction? I mean, really, how do you know that this is right? And so if you don't have that together, then I don't know. I just wish people would ask more questions. Honestly, I wish there were Q&As at the end of sermons and people can ask questions. That would be a lot more fun. It would certainly make church service more interesting.
Actually, you might be amused to know when we lived in Knoxville, we attended a church where at the start of the sermon, the pastor there went about a text number. They could text in their questions during the sermon, and he'd come out the end and he'd address the questions.
Oh, nice. That would be amazing.
So it was amazing. So this one is really in-depth. I'm going to go home and make a video log sometime this week about that question. But, I mean, it's really, I think, a great way to respond. And my way for... If you're listening to this on the podcast, you can't take advantage, but this is being done through Facebook Live, so we do have some chances here. So if anyone wants to ask a question of Dr. Delockery about Christianity in Colossians, feel free to. Now, you said that there's a hymn there at the start, but we should think of it more as a creed and such. And I'm kind of confused. I'm wondering what the difference is.
Well, there's not really a difference. It's just a change in our language. Hymns were they were meant to be. I mean, you could sing them, you could put them to music, but that wasn't really their primary purpose. A hymn like the one in Colossians was a way of giving theology. Think of it as formal oral tradition. There was oral sayings that people would communicate around, and it was, how people communicated information. But then there was a level above that, something that we don't really have today, where people actually memorized something, word for word by rote, and it was a way of communicating important ideas. In Christianity, for example, though it wasn't unique to Christianity, of communicating theology. So you find things like this in other places. Like, I know you're familiar with 1 Corinthians 15, and you have the for I delivered to you what I first received. The delivering and the receiving, the words there in 1 Corinthians 15 are for the formal passing on of oral tradition. It's like that. It's like the apostle saying, okay, here's what we want to say about the resurrection. These are the main points we want you to get. And so you need to get this. You need to memorize this, and this needs to become a foundation for your faith. And you see the same sort of thing here in Colossians. You see the same sort of creed. I don't know that you can call it that for 1 Corinthians 15, but it's the same formalized oral tradition that you find there.
It really does show us how much more seriously it seems Christianity was taken back when it first started, which would make sense since, Christianity could sometimes lead to little things like, death and such of the people involved. And
I understand.
Yeah. And oftentimes, before someone got baptized, they would make sure they really knew what they were getting into and such. Mm-hmm. And today, we don't really have the same thing. I mean, you and I apparently became Christians when we were kids, and let's face it, we didn't really understand too much about it.
No, I mean, I told you I started getting interested in Christianity at 13. I didn't know what salvation was until I got to college. I told you my church didn't teach anything. So it was... it's like, how can you grow up in church your whole life and not understand anything like that? But whereas them, it's like, okay, we need to understand this before you even join the thing. Now it's like, once you're in it, you still don't understand it, which is, we've fallen a long way, I think, from that. But I mean, even for the people who weren't facing death, I mean, if you join Christianity, you might be ostracized from your family. And that was a much bigger deal back then than it is now. I mean, it's a big deal now, but it was worse in a group culture.
Yeah. Now, you've said Colossians 1, that passage there, the first one, such that's a hymn. What makes us think it's a hymn?
Well, there's a lot of different reasons, and I don't want to go in too much depth because it's going to get super boring. But one of the ways is that there's a pronoun change between the verses that you have before it from like 11 through 14, and then what you see after like 21 through 23. Basically, what happens is you see that Paul is going along using like first and second person stuff mostly, like you would expect in a conversation. You and I are doing that. It's first and second person, I and you, and with occasional third person stuff there, where we're referencing outside material, he, she, it, they. That's the third person stuff. It's the outside material. And what you have in 11 through 14 is a lot of first and second person. It's a lot of I and you with some third person. There's conversation going on, referencing outside material. And then in 15 to 20, it's only third person. There's nothing else. And then 21 through 23, it comes back to a lot of first and second person with a little third. Like in verse 21, it says, and you. So it's like, okay, now we're taking this thing that we just talked about and pulling it back to how does it apply to you? And so you can clearly see in 15 to 20 that he's referencing outside material. Now you combine that with the fact that it's got a very, very different vocabulary and style and content than the rest of the letter. The vocabulary is very different. You get a lot of words that are found only here in the New Testament. And then you also, on top of that, added the fact that it's extremely structured. Everything in this whole thing is extremely structured. And you can divide it into basically two different strophes or two different verses with, like, I think a little middle transitional verse. And the structure of the first one and the second one, the first and second main ones, exactly parallel each other through all sorts of little details. And the middle one has its own little thing that shows it is set off. So it's a highly, highly structured thing, which is what you find when you're dealing with hymns or creeds or oral tradition. So all of those things point to the fact that there is a hymn there, and there's not really anything that points away from it being a hymn.
Well, we talked about this a little bit here. We have to say something on this topic because the Jehovah's Witnesses will love to come to our houses and say, look right here, this passage. Jesus is the firstborn of all creation. And I'm guessing right now you have to concede with him right there. Yep, Jesus must be a creature, right?
Yeah, that's it. No, we're done. That's I was a Christian, then I read that verse, and that's it. I had to leave it and say, well, no, he's a created being. They're right.
Mm-hmm. That's it for Arianism.
That's it. Go Arians. Not A-R-Y-A-N, not
yeah.
No, A-R-I-A-N, not A-R-Y-A-N.
Yeah.
Not the Nazis.
So, all of Jehovah's Witnesses are right. I mean, are we just hopelessly caught here?
No, we're really not. They're reading it at a surface level, and they're not actually understanding what's going on. For one, the big thing, verse 16, it says for. Probably a better translation of the word for would be because. Verse 16 is explaining why Christ is the firstborn of all creation. Just like you get some of the stuff later on in the hymn, going back to the structure, verse 19 has that same for, or I think should be because, explaining why he is the firstborn from the dead. So in 15b, you have firstborn of all creation. In 18 C, you have firstborn from the dead. So you got the two firstborns, and then following that is sort of a cause of why he is the firstborn of whatever he's the firstborn of. So verse 16, you cannot separate from firstborn of all creation. It explains why he is the firstborn of all creation. And the author of the hymn, probably not Paul. It's external material that most likely was given to him. So I'm going to say the author of the hymn. It's Paul almost certainly didn't write this. Verse 16 explains why he is the firstborn of all creation, and the author of the hymn goes to great lengths to explain that everything in creation was created by Christ. And you have the chiasm with heaven and earth, visible and invisible, heaven paralleling invisible, and earth paralleling visible. And then thrones, dominions, rulers, authorities, all of the power structures, whether earthly or spiritual. And two statements bookending that say that all things were created through him and for him. Everything in creation, nothing left out, was created by him. So basically what you have to do is you want to say that Christ was part of creation, is that he somehow bootstrapped himself into existence, that he created himself, which, as you know, that doesn't work logically. You can't create yourself. It's not a question of physics. It's a question of logic, because you'd have to already exist to create yourself. But if you already existed, then you wouldn't need to create yourself. It doesn't make any sense. So the Jehovah's Witnesses would have to say that Christ somehow broke logic in order to be able to create himself. And so that's one problem. The other is that firstborn doesn't actually have anything to do with literal physical birth. It does in many places in the scriptures. You see it some in the Old Testament, in the Septuagint, and you see it a little bit in the New Testament. But the only place in the New Testament that it clearly refers to physical birth when it's talking to Christ is Luke 2:7, where it's referring to Mary giving birth to Jesus. That's it. All of the other references, when they're talking about Christ, are either definitely not physical or they're sort of a question mark. So you can't say that on the use of this word that it's referring to physical birth. And I'll explain just a couple more things about that. In Psalm, I think it's 89, maybe 27 or something like that, David is referred to as the firstborn. And then it's followed up with the phrase that he is the highest, God is going to make him the highest of the kings of the earth. And firstborn is being compared to the highest king, and it has nothing to do with birth there. So, because David's already born, and so firstborn there is actually a reference to a ruling capacity. In a more general sense, firstborn is about being the first. It's about being a position of primacy or primacy. It's a reference to one's firstness, if you will. And that's really what you see here. He is the first of all creation. He is the one who's supreme over it. And verse 16 here explains why that is. It's because he created everything, nothing being left out. Great pains to go to being went to say that nothing's left out. So the Jehovah's Witnesses, like Arius, really don't have any reason to think that Christ was actually part of creation. Nothing points to that. I mean, a surface level reading might get you there, but if you actually look into what firstborn means, and if you actually look at verse 16 as explaining firstborn, then it doesn't point you that direction at all.
Mm-hmm. And couldn't we also say that we were really being as literal as we expect to be, that if Jesus is the firstborn of creation, that would mean creation would even have to predate Jesus. I mean, the firstborn of Jesse in the Old Testament has to come after Jesse.
Right, he definitely would. So if he's the firstborn of, well, yeah, see, and then you run into problems there too, because then, yeah, creation would actually have started with Christ, and then he created the rest of creation. So technically, Christ would have started creation, then he just created part of it, a lot of it, but it would have been just part of it. And then the hymn would just be wrong, because it wouldn't be all things were created by him. It would just be some things or most things. It wouldn't be all things, as it repeatedly emphasizes.
Well, so what should we think about Jesus then, based on this hymn?
Well, not what it sort of sounds like, and some people might think that the idea of like this a first century Jewish guy wearing sandals floating around outside of space and time creating things. It's not that. It's this hymn is trying to figure out a way to explain something that they didn't really have a good way of explaining. The person of Jesus baffled early Christians and still baffles a lot of people today, for good reason. And so what they were trying to do with this hymn, especially you see here in the first couple of verses, is trying to figure out how to explain his character. And you see a first stab here at incarnational thought. Mm-hmm. So it's like you want to say that Jesus is God, or say he's divine, but you don't want to say that he actually is the Father. But you also want to say that he's responsible for creation and doing things. You're sort of stuck in this, like, how do you attach him to God but not with God? But how do you make sure that people know he still is God? And what you have in verse 15 is saying, okay, well, he's the image of the invisible God, so he's not the invisible God because he is somehow related to the invisible God. And yet in verse 16, with the firstborn, by being the firstborn of all creation, he is explained really as the uncreated creator, because if he's not part of creation, then he's uncreated, right? Mm-hmm. So you have the author of the hymn putting two statements next to each other. It's the uncreated creator stuck next to the fact that he is somehow related to God and isn't actually God the Father. So when you have those two things stuck next to each other, you really are looking at sort of early incarnational thought, done a little bit different than they did later. I argue that what they're doing here is they're trying to explain Jesus in pictures rather than in propositions. It's trying to give you a mental image of what it's like. It's like explaining God as a rock. You see that sort of language in the Old Testament all the time. God is a rock. Well, it doesn't mean that he's actually a rock. It means that he's strong. He's a place that you can, put your, foundation in, and you can trust, and you can build other things, on it and so forth. That's picture language. Propositional language would be something like, God is causally active at every point in time and space, and such that no other agent, personal or impersonal, could hinder or override his causal actions, or something like that. It gets very, very confusing, and they're not actually really saying different things, but what you have here is sort of like the picture version of incarnational thought. And when you get on a little bit later, like the two persons in one nature, or the two natures in one person, that you get a little bit, a couple of centuries later, that's more of like the propositional way of trying to explain the incarnation. But you're getting the original version here, and I think that's something that people miss a lot of times. That you have in verse 15 and 16 a way of seeing, okay, he is God, but he's not the Father, and that's one of the things that's trying to be communicated with the hymn.
Mm-hmm. I think that if we're going to be Sims, we could be asking, what's the point in all this? Okay, now we know that Jesus is fully God and fully man, which is going to be great when we're playing a game of Trivial Pursuit. But geez, what difference does this make to our everyday Christian lives?
Well, there's a lot of steps between A and B there, but basically, if you want to know what direction to go, it helps if you understand the way the world actually is. Because, it's sort of like getting the right worldview or right religion. If Christianity is true, then the world actually is a certain way. If atheism is true, it's another way. And if you want to know about how you should live your daily life, it kind of makes a difference which of those two is true. So knowing what the world is actually like is sort of critical. Now that means that you actually have to back up and think through your worldview. I know, a horrible thing to ask people to do, but you actually have to back up and think through your worldview and think, do I have the right one or not? And part of explaining the Christian worldview is, who is this guy who was walking around Israel for a few years, 2,000 years ago, and why does that make such a difference? And Christians need to understand what the claims are that are made about him. And, if it's a bunch of nonsense, then leave it and go to something else, because this isn't what you would pick if you were just picking something to try to make you happy. Now you'd pick something else. So the only reason that you'd pick Christianity is if it's actually true, and there is a life after this one that we're in. So that's really what matters.
But let's suppose that we've got the average Christian who says, Yeah, but I'm wondering really, what difference does this make? I mean, okay, I believe in the Trinity, but why should that really matter to my daily Christian life? Is that just something I can use to beat up Jehovah's Witnesses and make them buy?
No, it comes back to the question of image and what an image actually is. I mean, if you look at it, he's the image of the invisible God. Okay, God is invisible. You can't see him. The image is a way that you can actually see him. So it's very simply, if you want to know what God looks like, you need to look at Jesus. Because he is the way that God chose to represent himself to the world. And even more foundational than that, it's saying that Christianity is a religion of revelation, that God wants to reveal himself to humanity, and he has chosen to do that. Well, where and how has he chosen to do that? Well, he's chosen to do that in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. That is what God looks like. If you want to see God, you look at Jesus. And so if you want to know how God wants you to live, you want to know what his character and what his nature are like, you need to look at the person of Jesus of Nazareth. So I don't know how you can get any more relevant than, actually seeing God than, saying, okay, this is where and how you see him.
I agree with you entirely. It just seems that, sadly, so many churches seem to miss out on this point, as if doctrine doesn't really matter.
Right, they do, but part of it is there is doctrine saying that you can, I think people get a little bit lost too. They think of doctrine as understanding this stuff that scholars who sit around in armchairs and smoke pipes understand, but nobody else in the world actually needs to know. But the thing is, if God chose to reveal it to humanity, that's actually not scholars saying it's important. That's God saying it's important. So right off the bat, you should say, well, all right, well, if God thinks it's important enough for me to know it, then I probably should bother knowing it. I mean, he should know what I need for my life better than anybody else because he created it and everything. But I also want to go back to the image thing as well, that, Christ represents God because he is the image of the invisible God. And there's a tie-in later with the actual image that humanity is being renewed in. It said that believers are being renewed in the image of their creator. Christ reflects God. We're meant to reflect Christ. And so the purpose of our life and what we're supposed to be doing is actually to represent God to the world. So if you want to have, if you want to actually fulfill your real purpose, not a made-up one that you have for yourself or something that makes you feel better, if you want to actually live out your purpose in this world the way God intended it, then you need to reflect God to the rest of the world. So it starts all the way back with theology saying, okay, Christ is the image of the invisible God. He is how God reveals himself to mankind. But it continues on down the line for humans to reveal God to other humans. Part of the way God reveals himself to the world is through the gospel. And you see that in the first, I think it's maybe like verse 6 or so, verse 5 and verse 6. And then you see that again just a few verses later. The gospel is actually being put in parallel with believers. And those are sort of the two ways that God reveals himself to the world, at least as Paul is describing it here. So we have quite a responsibility that if our job is to reveal God to the rest of the world, to other believers in part, but also, and probably more importantly, to those who don't follow Christ, that's pretty important. And I can't think of a better thing that you can do with your life than, number one, fulfill God's purpose, but also to do it by revealing him to other people. That's what we were created to do. So you can't get any more application based than that.
I think it's also important to stress that we're going to talk about the love of God, like coming back to what we said at the start, so many of our songs at church and such do over and over. It's important to know who this God is. And too many of us, I think, really think we know God, who God is based on our feelings and the experiences in our lives.
Right, and we sort of come up with a God that we think, well, I think God is probably like this, and I think God is probably like that. And it's like, all right, well, some of your thoughts might be okay, but some of them are probably wrong. Instead of coming up with the way you think God is like, perhaps you should try to find out how God has revealed himself, because that's probably going to be a little bit better.
Now, let's move on a little bit further in the book. When we get to the second chapter, it tells us to avoid philosophy and such. Now, I've got some books in my library by Plato and Aristotle. Should I burn those?
Yeah, you're a heathen. No, it's the philosophy it's talking about is a very specific one. It's not philosophy in general. The problem is the problem is that when you look in verse 8 where the reference is, it's comparing the way that is according to Christ and the way that is not according to Christ, the way it's according to human tradition. And it's saying one way is trying to reach God by building itself up from the ground. It's a man-made attempt to reach up to God. And Paul is comparing it with the Christian way, which is saying this is God's way of reaching down to man. Because, again, Christ is the image of the invisible God. Christ is the way God chose to reach down into the world and say, here I am, follow me. That's going to be a whole lot better than humans trying to say, well, I think we should probably do this and I think we should probably do that. The God-made way is going to be better than the man-made way. And that's really what the verse is saying. It's not against philosophy at all. It's a reference to that specific philosophy that's trying to build itself up according to human tradition.
I believe it's the very next verse when it says that about Christ, that in him dwells all the fullness of deity bodily. And is this hearkening back to that hymn in the first chapter?
Yeah, it's a reference to verse 19 in the hymn. It talks about the fullness of deity dwelling in Christ. And here it's Paul expanding on that and saying that the fullness of deity or fullness of God dwells in Christ bodily. And really this is this goes back to the question of revelation again. It's about the revelation of God to man, and it's specifically a temple reference. God in the Old Testament was said to exist in all of creation. He filled creation and so forth. And there's many places that you can point to that said that God was, throughout all of creation. However, he was present in the temple in Jerusalem in a very special way. It talks about his fullness dwelling in the temple. And really what's going on here is you're getting a reference back to that. There's a couple of images that the hymn and also later on in the letter used to try to bridge the gap between God and man, because it's sort of like the transcendence immanence problem, that transcendence is a God's way up there. How can he ever interact with humans? And immanence is like, well, we want him to be near us as well, to answer our prayers and walk with us and so forth. But how can the God who's way up there do that? And Paul and the author of the hymn use several images to do that. One of them is wisdom, which is where you get the creation of everything. And the idea behind that is that wisdom was how God created the world, and was sort of this, like if you look in Proverbs, the first few chapters, especially from chapter 8, wisdom was sort of the semi-personification of God. It's actually a woman in chapter 8. But wisdom was responsible for creation. And so this is how they're trying to figure out how to explain who Jesus is in ways that people understand, but the ways that they had on hand didn't quite go far enough. So wisdom was one of the things that they used. Wisdom was the way God created the world. And Jesus, Christ was responsible for the creation of the world. But they go a bit beyond that and say, well, he was actually the goal of creation. Wisdom was never the goal of creation in any wisdom thought. But in chapter 1, verse 16, it says that creation was made for him. And so you see wisdom thought, they sort of use it as a springboard. Well, Christ is the wisdom of God, but more than that. And you see the same thing here with the temple language, that the fullness of God dwelled in the temple. And you see that in the Old Testament, especially like the dedication of the temple by Solomon. You see the fullness of God dwelling in the temple. But they go a bit farther in this letter, and they say, well, the wisdom of God dwelled in a special way, actually in a person. So not just the temple. He dwelled in Jesus of Nazareth in the same way that he dwelled in the temple. And that's what's going on behind this fullness of deity dwells bodily. They're saying the same way that God dwelled in the temple, he dwelled in this Jewish man who lived and was crucified. And that's quite a statement.
Mm-hmm. So, we've been talking about contrasting this with other worldviews. Let's get something like Islam, because you're talking about how this is the Trinity doctrine working itself out and such. Does that mean Muslim fans have a simplistic approach and they say, well, show me that version of the Bible where God says he's a Trinity?
Yeah, it's really hard to do that because, number one, as you know, Trinity didn't show up until later. There wasn't a concept until later. That's when they were trying to figure out the propositional terms to really, I think, answer questions. They started with the picture language, and then when questions developed, they tried to figure out how to answer the questions, and that's when you got into the later Trinitarian and incarnational debates and the different languages about the two persons, the three persons in one nature, and then two natures in one person, that sort of thing. So one, it's just asking for something that's not there, because they're asking for the answers to later questions, not what was originally put there. So you should just be looking for the pictures, which I think are there. And we talked about that a lot. I think those are actually there if Christians know how to explain them. But yeah, they're asking for something that is not going to be able to found. It's like somebody asking for, well, show me the statement where Jesus said that he was God. Well, it's not going to do that, because if he said he's God, people are going to try to identify him with a father, and they're going to try to think that this guy who's living here actually is the Father, and Jesus didn't want to do that because, again, it's a Trinity. It's three. It's not one. So he isn't actually the Father. He's co-equal with the Father, but he isn't the Father. So they're really asking for something that you can't give because it doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm. Now, when you were talking about the temple idea and such, I'm curious, have you ever read the work of, say, John Walton on Genesis 1, for instance, about creation being a temporal account?
Oh, yeah, I absolutely have. I'm a big fan of John Walton's work. And I think what you actually see there is the continuation of the temple theme, a continuation of this theme of sacred space that, originally God set up the cosmos as a cosmic temple, and the garden was created as sacred space within that, and then sacred space fell apart. And then you see in the Old Testament there's sacred space being refound and is reformulated or remade by God. And Tower of Babel is another attempt. It's an attempt by man to create his own sacred space, and God says, no, I'm not going to let you do that. I'm going to take care of it myself. In the very next chapter, then you get God calling Abraham, and he begins the renewal of humanity, and and then you get into the New Testament, and that sacred space theme is continued, and you have Jesus as the temple, and then you have and then when you talk about the Holy Spirit living in believers and us becoming renewed in the image of our Creator, we're actually made into small temples, and so you see a complete return to the direction of a return to what God was intending to do in the beginning, and everything fell apart, and then he's been working back towards that. So you actually see in the Jesus as the temple, and more importantly, believers as little temples, the creation, or not the creation, but the completion of God's renewal work on humanity, and by extension creation.
And if anyone's interested in looking at this further, I would point you back to previous shows. We've had John Martin on here, I believe, 3 times. The Lost Word of Genesis 1, Lost Word of Adam and Eve, and the Lost Word of Conquest. And next month, we're going to be having Trimper Longman on, talk about a book he co-wrote with John Wharton, The Lost Word of the Flood. So if this is of interest to you all, then please be listening to those past shows and looking for the one next month. But I'd like to remind everyone also at this point you're listening to the Deeper Waters podcast. I've got Dr. Matt Delockery here talking about the Christology of Colossians and what difference it makes to us today. If you're here next week, you're going to hear absolutely nothing, because I'll be at the Mention of Ours conference next week, God willing. If you're here the week after that, we're going to have Dr. Ken Stewart on with us, and he's going to be talking about his book, In Search of Ancient Roots. If you consider yourself a Protestant today, are you following in the lines of traditions of the early church, or should you consider maybe Catholicism or Eastern Orthodoxy have that, but you don't? We'll be discussing those kinds of questions next time. Now let's get back to Dr. Delockery and talking about Colossians. And now the next several verses of Colossians, they're very much atonement-centered, I think at least. Maybe I'm wrong on that. What do you think about them?
No, I think you're right. I think what's going on just after that is the explanation of how all this stuff applies to the believer. And so you get all the theology in chapter 1, and sort of you get this is how you're to live, this is how you're supposed to live, and these are the actions that you're supposed to do, and so forth in chapter 3. And here in chapter 2, you're getting sort of part of the connection between those two things. And how exactly does all this stuff about Christ matter? How are you attached into Christ? And then you got a series of 5 metaphors here that explain exactly how you're attached to Christ, the circumcision, the baptism, and so forth. So you get your connection with Christ, or the believer's connection with Christ, here in verses 11 through 15. Do I think it's penal substitution theory, ransom theory, any of those? No, I don't really get an answer as to whether it's one way or the other. It's what you have here is sort of like a piling up of metaphors. And it's meant to sort of give you a big picture of things. Like no one metaphor really explains in total exactly what this connection with Christ is like or how it works. But it's in putting them all together, you get a general picture. You find that the believer is given entrance into the new people of God. You find that there's a new relationship that you have with Christ that he is now part of the people of God, and in that you have freedom from the powers and authorities that are against you. Anybody else that that might try to do you harm, whether it's spiritual beings or whether it's earthly powers, because Christ is the head. Going back to him being head over all creation and so forth. Since he's the top dog, then nobody else can affect anything that's under his control, which includes us. And you also have forgiveness for moral transgressions. So it's those 3 things. These 5 metaphors really point to those 3 things: that entrance into the new people of God, forgiveness for moral transgressions, and freedom from the powers and authorities that might stand against you. And that's sort of what these things are trying to explain, how this stuff about Christ and what he's done and the fact that he died and rose again from the dead, how that impacts a believer's life.
Mm-hmm. And I don't come down on any one side entirely. I mean, you tell me I think there's a lot to penal substitution, but I think there's some good stuff for Christus Victor model and such. I don't think they necessarily contradict, but what I often tell people is I don't have any definitive answers entirely, but, all I know is Jesus forgave me and new creation is being ushered in right now.
Yeah. Works for me.
He goes on then, after us, to says, therefore let no one judge you and say, new moons and Sabbaths and festivals and things of that sort. Is this a case of him? He's laid out the doctrine, and now he's giving the application.
Well, it's not quite getting to application yet. It's a little bit application, a little bit. Now, this is where he's getting into his polemic against the alternative philosophy, and this is where a lot of the main data about what the philosophy actually is comes from. It comes from right here, and you can tell that there's some references here. Okay, well, there's questions, food and drink, and the moon, Sabbath. Okay, well, there's probably some Jewish element to this because otherwise it wouldn't be talking about a Sabbath. And there's rituals and feasts, and then there's a little bit later. There's some ascetic things. Verse 21, like do not handle, do not taste, do not touch. Might have been a little bit of ascetic practices there, and so that's where you get sort of the idea of what the philosophy is a little bit, though. You don't get a full picture of what it is. And then there's this odd thing about the worship of angels. A lot of scholars don't think that's actually worshiping the angels themselves. It's worshiping with angels. Depending on how you take that, it could be worshiping God alongside the angels, and possibly the goal of their ascetic practices was to be able to participate in the heavenly worship of the angels of God. But I mean, it's sort of guesswork because there's not a whole lot to go on. There's a few things, and so this is a comparison with the philosophy, but mostly against some of their specific practices.
Mm-hmm. So does this mean then, and since I refer to Sabbaths and new moons, Jewish festivals, that this was actually some sort of Jewish philosophy?
Possibly, and that's why scholars are leaning more towards the Jewish mysticism today. You don't find a lot of people who take a really strong stance, too many of them, on the philosophy. They'll say, well, I think it's probably this, but there's always going to be a little bit of element of doubt because it's not fully explained. As maybe something like in Galatians, it's a bit obvious. You know exactly who the opponents are. It's going to be the Judaizers, but here it's like, well, it's probably this, but we're not 100% sure.
Now what struck me odd about being possibly a Jewish philosophy is you wouldn't think a Jewish philosophy would really have anything to say about Jesus, but that seems to be what Paul emphasizes over and over.
Say one more time?
What strikes me as odd is you wouldn't think a Jewish philosophy would have anything to say about Jesus.
Well, it may not. It may not have anything to say about Jesus. It may have just said something about, oh well, Christ is probably one among many, but he's not the supreme authority or anything like that. And Paul would come back and say, no, he actually is the supreme authority. He's not merely one among many. And probably the verse that I find most interesting in this section is verse 17. It says that these are a shadow of the things to come. The substance belongs to Christ. I think what's most interesting here is that Paul is not discounting the idea that there are other things that you can know about God. Just in the world, there are things that you can know. I mean, we talk about this all the time as general revelation. That if God really is the creator of the world, you should be able to know something about the creator from his creation. The picture is going to be a bit fuzzy. You're not going to get everything, but you can know some things. And I think that's what he's saying here. Yeah, these are a shadow of the things to come. There's a little bit that you can know from here, and that's great and everything. But the full picture is to be found in Christ. And so really, I think I think statements like this should point Christians in the direction of particularism rather than exclusivism. In other words, Christ and Christianity is the way that God has chosen to reveal himself to the world, and this is the true path. But that doesn't mean there aren't bits of truth that you can find elsewhere. It's just that the full truth is here, if that makes sense.
Yeah, Dr. Delockery, we have a question here that's come through Facebook Live and asking, what do you think about the claim, since we're talking about the deity of Christ, what do you think about the claim that really comes from paganism?
That the claim about the deity of Christ comes from paganism?
Yes, that Jesus as God comes from paganism.
Well, it seems a little odd to me, the idea that Jesus is a God, or I mean, this is the same answer I would give to the dying and rising God myth. Apart from any consideration of any particular data on how it would have come specifically over, and if you're going to say that Jesus as a God came specifically from paganism, I would want to see evidence to show that actually happened. But leaving that aside, and the question of whether or not there's actually any evidence to say that he came over, the concept that Jesus as a God came over from paganism, you have to sort of wonder how Christianity could have sort of the internal debates that it did in the early centuries. Like, okay, so Jesus, they imported these pagan ideas, but then they had issues about Jews and Gentiles and whether or not we can eat together. They had questions about circumcision and meat sacrificed to idols. It's like, now hold on a minute. If we imported our main central fact from paganism, how is it that we so quickly forgot that? And then all of a sudden, like, well, we don't know if we can let Gentiles into this whole Christian thing. Well, we don't know if we can have meat sacrificed to idols. We don't know about it doesn't seem congruous. It doesn't seem like it makes sense to say that they took their main point from outside Judaism, and then from those same sources started to have all sorts of problems. Like, we don't know that we can accept this. So it just doesn't make sense to me in a very general way, apart from any specific considerations.
Okay, we've got another question here. Someone going back to Colossians 1 talks about how Christ uses terms for, been, and in, sustained, held together, etc. And does this support Irenaeus' idea of recapitulation? When Christ died, we died. When he rose, we rose.
As far as that, I think most of these things are, I'm not familiar with Irenaeus' view of recapitulation, so I'm just going to have to guess on exactly what you're talking about there. I'm thinking what you're saying is that saying we actually died when Christ died, we actually rose when he rose. I don't know that these things are meant to be pushed to that level of specificity. I think mostly what you're getting here is an explanation of how we are attached into Christ. Christ died and rose again. And that's an actual historical fact that he did those things. And this is, I think, is an explanation of how Christ went through death and came out the other side, and he's taking us with him. Just as he did this, so we are also doing it as well. I think we're still in sort of the picture mode here. We're not really getting into the propositional language here. It's still painting a portrait, saying we are with Christ, and what he did, he is taking us along with him in the same journey.
Now, when we get to the end of Colossians 2, it talks about that since we've died with Christ to be elemental or spiritual forces of this world, why do we still play according to the rules, as it were? Do not handle, do not taste, do not touch. What's Paul saying here?
Well, I think he's pointing at the sort of ascetic practices that some people in philosophy were trying to say, that it's going back to this, what he said in verse 8, that this human tradition, this man-made sort of ground up, how do you reach up to God? And they're trying to be ascetically or physically rigorous to themselves and live very, very strictly in order to try to make themselves more holy. And he's saying you don't have to do that. These are all human teachings. He says in verse 22, according to human precepts and teachings. And he's like, these are human things, and you don't have to follow those. The true way is through Christ. You've died to this world, and you're living for the next. And you see that in verses 1 through 4 of chapter 3, just in the next little section, saying you've died to this world, you're supposed to live for the next world. Because you've died and been raised with Christ, then you should focus on the next world, because that's your ultimate destination. And that's what he's going to get into, is like, okay, this is where you're headed. Since you're headed there, and since that's your ultimate final reality, then don't bother with the things of this earth. It's just not important. I don't want to go off into another direction and say, like, well, things of this world don't matter. You don't have to pay any attention to that. He's not saying that, but it's like, focus on what's of real and ultimate importance. If you're talking about an eternal existence with God, if you're talking about an eternal life, then why don't you focus on what's eternal and not on something that's going to be passing away here very, very soon?
Yeah, I think some people would say that, is Paul telling us to be so heavenly minded that we're no earthly good?
No, yeah, it's absolutely not that. I mean, that's a bit of a misreading of this, and it's when you look at something like this, it's really easy to go astray a little bit. Whether it's this section or whether it's the issue with Jehovah's Witnesses and the firstborn of all creation and so forth, there's so many places where you can just be just a little bit off and just a little bit off here. It's going to take you off in this direction. And it's the only way I know how to say it is there's a huge importance on having wisdom when you read something that's talking about things of this level of significance. When you're talking about the history and the story of God and man on a grand scale, you can't come to that, being naive, and you need a bit of wisdom on that. It takes some maturity to be able to appreciate something like that, and that's one of those things that, like, being so heavenly minded that you're of no earthly good, that if you came to that as a mature and wise and experienced person, I don't think you would end up in that position. And I think what happens is a lot of people just read this sort of thing on a surface level and haven't really gotten into that or haven't really appreciated it from that depth. And that's why you end up with all sorts of things like that just, if you had a bit more depth, then you just wouldn't end up doing that sort of thing.
And I think we can also contrast where he talks about things like do not handle, do not taste, do not touch. He says, forget these words. Here are the things you really don't want to handle: sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, greed. Is Paul making that contrast?
He's not making it explicitly, but I think I think that probably would come out, that there's a difference between they're saying these are the things that you don't do, and then very shortly he's going to get into say this is what you actually need to not do, and here's why, and then he explains a bit of the why on it. So yeah, he's contrasting what they're saying you should do, focus on the festivals and the new moons and the Sabbath, and shouldn't do the do not handle, do not taste, do not touch. And then he's about to explain this is the way of Christ. This is what you actually should and shouldn't do with the put on and the put off.
Yeah, I think one of the big lessons we could learn from where he says later on also is when he starts talking about forgiveness, for instance. I remember a few years ago, shortly after I got married, and I was working at a Walmart as a cashier, and during a slow time when the girl was running because of me, he says, Nick, you seem like a pretty wise guy and such. You seem to know what you're talking about, very spiritually in tune. What's the best way to learn how to forgive someone? And I said immediately, get married. You're going to spend a lot of your time either giving or receiving forgiveness, and I've spent a whole lot more time receiving it. And as we kept going on, I said, I'm just having a very hard time forgiving someone else. And I said, what's his name? I said, how did you? It is always a boyfriend or something like that you're having a hard time forgiving. But forgiveness is something that we do have a hard time dealing with from the church today, isn't it?
It really is. I don't know, it's probably one of the hardest things that you can have to do, because you really don't want to. That's why you have to be told to forgive. Otherwise, you would just do it naturally. The fact is, you really just don't want to forgive. I don't want to. So, but that's what we're told to do. We're supposed to reflect Christ, and he forgave us. It's like, fine, okay.
I can tell you that on my end, that usually if someone does something against me, where I'm very passive in that sense, like, not too big a deal to me. I can handle it and such. Let's just make things right. And now if someone goes after my Princess Allie, that's an entirely different story. I am ready to let loose the dogs of war. It's a raging inferno here, and I have to work really hard to not hold on to a grudge against them.
Mm-hmm. I understand.
And I'm also thinking that, I've talked about this kind of thing before, and it says, like, how can you forgive me if I do such and such to you? And I always say the same thing. I said, I mean, it's pretty easy for me. I just look at everything that Christ has forgiven me for. And then I think, well, I gotta do this because whatever anyone else might have done to me, it's nothing compared to what I've done to Jesus.
And I think in that you're getting towards the definition of what love actually is, because Jesus said we're supposed to love our enemies, and I think the point people pass over so many times is like, well, how exactly are you if love is like this romantic emotional feeling, how exactly are you supposed to have a romantic emotional feeling for your enemies? I mean, they're your enemies. I mean, that's the whole point. They're not people that you like. They're people that you really, really don't like and probably hate. And so if that's all that love is, then that's an impossible command. You're supposed to have warm, fuzzy feelings for people that you have opposite feelings for. And so I think what he's talking about when he's saying love is like, you need to be looking at something else. You need to be looking at, I would say that it's actually selflessness, and you need to be acting in a selfless manner towards them, even though you don't like them. And I think forgiveness is a big part of that, where you learn how to forgive somebody that you really don't want to forgive. And I think that's part of what's going on there.
And I'd like to remind everyone at this point listening to the Deeper Waters podcast, and everything we do is supported by listeners like you. And I really encourage you to give. Please go to the website that I have, deeperwatersapologetics.com, and on the side you'll see a link, help support the work of Deeper Waters Christian Ministries. And when you click on the link in there, you get taken to the Ministry of Risen Jesus. You go into the right place. That's the Ministry of Mike and Debbie Lacona, my in-laws. You make your donation, you get in touch with Mike or Debbie or me or Allie and say, hey, I made my donation. I want to go to Nick Peters. I want to go to Deeper Waters. And that will happen. Now, you can also go and buy some ebooks I've either written, such as Defining Inerrancy, or co-written, Groundless, God and Natural Disasters. And one I've written, is A Creed for the Ages, the Apostles' Creed, and Today's Christian. Co-written is also Defining Inerrancy. Christian Answers for Rich Generations Questions. And guys, we've been talking about forgiveness with our wives and such. One of the ways you can make up for those stupid mistakes you made with them sometimes is by using jewelry. We have a jewelry store here, and you can buy something very special for that lady in your life. And, if you want a last-minute Mother's Day gift, this could work fine, too. You just go to the Premier Jeweler. If you need some help, let me know, and I'll show you how it's done with the code word LOVE for Deeper Waters. And whatever you purchase, 25% of that will go to Deeper Waters. So as you guys know, what I always tell you, you can buy something special for your wife or girlfriend to make up that big screw-up that you recently did with them. Or you can buy something special to make up that big screw-up that I know you're going to make with them. And if you can't do any of these, please consider going on iTunes and leaving a positive review of the Deeper Waters podcast. I really love to see them. Now, Dr. Delockery, do you have any organization you'd like to see people donate to?
Yes, I do. I started and lead a group called Why Should I Believe? It's a campus ministry at Georgia Tech that I started. I went there, and now I do ministry there, trying to help students who are looking for answers, just like I have been. So we have a chapter at Georgia Tech. There's one at Cornell that started this year, and there should be one starting at Georgia State in this fall. So if you go to whyshouldibelieve.org, you can look at under the staff section. I'm under there, Matt Delockery, and you can donate that way, or you can go to my personal website, mattdelockery.com, find the same thing. There you can find links to my podcast and blog and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Now, we've had someone ask here, about the forgiveness thing. Is Paul saying that God is unconditionally forgiving?
Well, I think Paul, he's not actually talking about that in the letter. He doesn't get into the question of whether he is forgiving everything or whether he is not. I think from other places that he says, yes, he does. He forgives humans of everything that they've done wrong. There's not a sin that you can commit that God can't or won't forgive. But it's not something that's being discussed in the letter here. One of the things that you get when you're actually talking about a Christian worldview is the fact that there's a lot of things that are left out. If something most people don't really realize when you look through the letter, there's pretty much no mention of the Holy Spirit. If we're talking about the big things of Christianity, it's a little surprising. There's a brief reference to the Spirit in chapter 1, verse 8, but that's it. There's no other mention, and that one's not even 100% certain it's the Holy Spirit, though it probably is. So, again, you're not getting a full Christian theology here. You're getting sort of how you would compare Christianity to another worldview. And the Holy Spirit is something that I think is very important for the life of the believer, but it may or may not be something that compares well with another religion. I'll give you another example. Some people may not have liked the fact that I just said it may not compare well with another religion and say the Holy Spirit's not important. Something else that we usually think is pretty important that's not in here is the Lord's Supper. It's not mentioned in Colossians, though Paul seems to think elsewhere that it is very important. But if you look at that, that's the Lord's Supper is actually something that's a bit derivative. It is, depending on your particular view of it, whether it's a symbol or remembrance or whether it's an actual means of grace. But all of that is based on the death and the resurrection of Christ. So it's not. So the death and resurrection of Christ is the primary thing. The Lord's Supper is the secondary thing, if that makes sense. And so really in this letter, all that Paul is focusing on is just the primary things, and specifically the primary things that compare Christianity to another worldview. So things that may be very, very important for the life of the believer don't necessarily always show up here because they may or may not compare well with another worldview. So again, you're not getting a full Christian theology in the letter, so you should understand that.
Now let's move on a little bit further. We get what's known as, I believe, the house rules, how families should interact.
That's that fun section.
Yeah. Now, first off, what do you think about this section in comparison to Ephesians?
Well, it's a bit different emphasis. In Ephesians, you have a lot more about the relationship between wives and husbands. Here in Colossians, it's almost entirely focused on the relationship between slaves and masters. Part of that is, I think, because of the situations in the two different churches. Probably there was an issue with the slaves and their relationships with the masters in Colossae. Probably because Christianity recruited a lot from the bottom of society, because when it's saying that everybody is equal, the people at the bottom are going to respond to that. The people at the top, not so much. So there would have been issues with household order, especially in relations of slaves and masters. Also, Ephesians is focusing a lot more on the relationship between Christ and the church, and there's emphasis on the bride. So there's going to be a bigger emphasis on the relationship between the husband and wife, because it's being made as a comparison to Christ and the church. So there's a difference in emphasis here. But I mean, this is a very big problem passage for quite a lot of people, because really I think it's the longest passage on slavery in the New Testament, especially sounding like it's good. You get some ones in the Gospels that are longer, but that's because they're in story form, so they're bound to be a bit longer. But you get a very extended section here saying that slaves, you need to obey your masters, and that's a really, really hard thing for modern ears to hear.
And let's get into that a little bit, man, because there'll be some people like, say, Robert Price, who will go on Unbelievable and say, well, why didn't Paul just tell masters to set those slaves free and try to end slavery if it was so evil?
Well, there's a very good reason for that, because he wouldn't have been the first person to try that if he did. And Rome was kind of sensitive about slave rebellions, and think Spartacus and all the slaves that got crucified who rebelled against Rome, and his rebellion was not the only one. It happened a lot in the 2nd century BC and up through maybe like the middle of the 1st century BC. Can't remember the exact dates offhand. It's around there. It slowed down a little bit after that, but Rome had a very not good relationship with slaves. They were rebelling a lot, and slave rebellions were always put down very, very brutally. Lots of bloodshed, and it didn't go well. So think about Paul's perspective here. He's one of the leaders of this new little fledgling religion. If he comes out and says, you're all free now, so just throw off your chains, stop obeying your masters. Rome would have squashed Christianity before it even had a chance to get going. So that wasn't really a practical option for Paul, even if it's true that slavery is wrong. Practically speaking, he just can't say that, or all of his new Christian converts are going to get slaughtered. So that's not a very good option for him. So the question is, well, what do we do about this? Well, and I think what you have here is sort of it's in one part, it's a case for how to live all of the values that he gives in the previous verses, but it's also a sort of a guideline for how Christians should live in a world that has different values than they do. And the short of it's basically saying, okay, you're in this world that thinks differently than you do, and they live differently. You have to still live within the world systems. You can't just go off and do your own thing. He's not telling them to be like the Essenes and go off and live in the desert, and because you need to live in the world, because you have to have impact on people. If you're going to be witnesses, if you're going to be revealers of God, if you're going to be his representatives and his images, you have to be around people so they can actually see it. So you have to live in the world somewhat, but you don't have to act quite like it. So he's saying, okay, follow these standard rules. And the ideas of slaves obeying your masters and wives obeying your husband. This is part of the household organization discussion that goes back as far as Aristotle. And these were considered high morals that he was telling them to follow. But he does something differently. He adds his own version. It's like, okay, you have to live in the world and you have to do these sorts of things. But he adds a little bit. He's like, okay, first of all, he gives reciprocal duties. Wives, submit to your husbands, but husbands, love your wives. That is not something that happens in Aristotle or in any other current thought. The idea that husbands have duties to their wives, not there. It's a one direction only. It says, children, obey your parents, but fathers, do not provoke your children lest they become discouraged. There was no, parents don't, be nice to your children. There wasn't any of that. And then again, this, and you get into 4:1 is where it talks about that the masters treat your bondservants justly and fairly, knowing that you also have a master in heaven. He's reminding them, it's like, yes, you have slaves here on earth, but remember, you are a slave to someone else. And if you look elsewhere, it talks about Paul and Timothy being the servants of the Father. So he's trying to explain that you are actually serving Christ, just like somebody is you. So think about this relationship and think about how you would want to be treated. So on the one hand, there are reciprocal duties that he's saying, and that's new and that's quite radical. So live within society, but remember, you have a duty to them as well. But also, he's telling them, do your work, servants, do your work for the Lord, and masters, remember that you have a Lord in heaven. There's this constant reminder that you're living for something else. So what he does is he actually walks a very, very fine line. He's trying to remind them, on the one hand, you are all equal because everybody here serves Christ. So we are equal. However, we are in this very unusual situation that, or should I say, we are in this very usual situation that's not right. And we have to continue living in this. But if what you do is you live in this situation that everybody else around you does, but you do it differently, if you live better than you have to, then you're going to show your neighbors something that they're not going to see anywhere else, because they're going to take notice. Like, why are you doing this? Why are you treating your servants so well? Servants, why are you actually working hard for your masters? Why are you doing that? Because it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And I guarantee you, if you see something like that and you start to notice that all the people who are doing this are Christian, you're going to take notice and you're going to start to ask why. And I think that's sort of the direction that Paul was going in. He didn't have the option of just freeing everybody. He just couldn't. Rome would have wiped everybody out. They just killed everybody because that's what they do. He's showing them this is how you live a Christian life in a non-ideal situation. And I see the household code as sort of a case study, if you will, to how to put all these things into practice about living selflessly and things like that. He just talked about earlier in chapter 3. How do you put this into practice in a very real and very difficult situation?
We can say later on, when Christianity became more established, that yes, you have people like John Chrysostom giving sermons against slavery, and the Christians would often buy slaves just to set them free.
Yeah, you see things like that, and then later on, you have people like Wilberforce who are arguing against slavery because of Christianity, and I think you can do that. I just think Paul was in a situation where he had absolutely no ability to do anything like that. So
I think today, when so many atheists talked about how, why doesn't the Bible just outright condemn slavery? I think it just shows how much they've been affected by Christianity. Because if you go out on the street today and such, and you go up to someone and say, "Yeah, do you think we should consider bringing back slavery?" They would be aghast at the thought and think, "How could you? Slavery is horrible," and things like that. But if you went to the first century world, and you said, "Hey, do you think we should get rid of slavery?" They would be aghast at you and say, "What are you talking about? Slavery is essential today."
Yeah, it really is. That's what they would have said and what they would have thought. And so, there's an unwillingness for, I think, people outside Christianity to be willing to take things like that into context and to understand and to be. You have to be a little bit generous to the Christian claim to be willing to say, okay, that's probably true. On the other hand, there also is an unwillingness on the part of Christians to take time to, number one, understand the historical context, and number two, to make sure that you consider the historical context on things that you may not necessarily like. And that goes back to, you're talking about John Walton's books. Like, there are a lot of people who just reject that out of hand because, oh no, it couldn't possibly have, the Israelites couldn't possibly have been, answering questions that their Canaanite neighbors would have been asking. It's like, no, you're just talking about a mindset from that time period, that they were answering certain questions. It's not saying that they're copying theology over. It doesn't make any difference. A lot of Christians won't even consider that. So there seems to be an unwillingness by people on all sides to actually consider historical context and take the time to find out, what did these things actually mean?
Yeah, and that's considered, I've been going back to another part of the house wars, because if we consider, say, the longer section in Ephesians on the commands of the husbands, because those are pretty verbose and such, most of the guys in the audience, if they were around using today's term, they'd probably ask, "Is Paul smoking crack?" or something like this.
Yeah, a lot of things that he says just don't make any sense today unless you take the time to understand what's really going on there.
Mm-hmm. Because today we live in a world where, romantic love is very common in marriage, and that's the basis for it. But back in Paul's day, that wasn't the case. Marriage was pretty much for survival, for production of children, the unifying of families, and a wife could more often be just the person you're going to have children with, who will inherit your legacy, or maybe even just your favorite sex partner, but that's it.
Yeah. Or maybe not your favorite sex partner, maybe just someone who's going to have children with, and then you have somebody else that you really like having sex with. And she was just there for, the official means. And that was actually really common. So
Paul's commands, in any sense, they are still very revolutionary for the time.
They really are. And even more so when you understand that he's not being naive and just saying, oh, you need to just, be free. You need to do that. It's like he comes up with a pretty wise and might say even a little bit shrewd way of only without the negative connotations of dealing with the situation. He's walking a tightrope here, and he seemed to manage it pretty well because he got the ideas through. Christians carried on understanding that people are equal, but he managed to, keep everybody from getting slaughtered. So he accomplished his job pretty well.
Yeah, I think one of the mistakes a lot of our skeptical friends make is they look at the ethical systems being dealt with and they compare it to our time, which is after about 1900 years of Christianity, and say, well, it should be just like the end result that we have today. Well, not really. Paul's just planting seeds, as it were.
Yeah, there's so much influence that Christianity has had. People don't even realize sometimes when they talk about, Christians are sometimes, especially, some Christian does something wrong, whatever, and they get accused of not being humble or something like that. It's like, well, hold on a minute. Now that may be true in that particular instance, but people today accept humility as a virtue, like it's a good thing. It's like, hold on, we Christians invented that. Humility was not a virtue; it was a vice. And in Stoic thought, pride was the virtue, and humility was considered a moral failure. And Christianity introduced the idea that humility was a good thing. It's like, so now check your facts, check your history, because we invented that humility is a good thing. So just remember where that came from. And because Christianity actually has been successful in quite a lot of things, that people don't realize necessarily where that came from. And that's one of those things.
Yeah, I think many people, when they look back on Christian history, they say, oh, the Crusades, the Inquisition, the Salem witch trials, and things like that. And most time they don't even bother to understand these subjects. And that's where hold on, more complicated, really realize they meant other things like the rise of medicine, the rise of hospitals, the spread of literacy, the founding of universities, the rise of science, the end of slavery, all these other things.
And they don't bother to consider what the context is either. It's like the reason that the things like the Salem witch trials happen is because people believe witches are real. If you believed your neighbor was putting curses on you and would, possibly kill your family in some horrible way, or kill all the crops and everybody would die of starvation, you'd be pretty upset too if you thought that person was living next to you. That's like saying that, a member of ISIS was living next door to you. If you found that out, you'd be a little upset. How would you react now? And if that was true, would it really be that much different than people who believe witches were living next door? So let's, now I'm not trying to defend the witch trial people. I'm just saying, think about the difference. The difference is that they believe witches are real. We don't. But if you put it in the context of something that we actually do believe is real, we're not really that much different.
Yeah. Now, when we're getting towards the end of the letter, what are some things that you're noticing at the end of the letter?
Are you talking about, it's still in chapter 3 or still chapter 4? Well, chapter 4 is really, he's just sort of pulling all home, and like verse 7 to the end is pretty much sending his greetings and things like that to the end. I made reference to verse 18 earlier about Paul writing the greeting with his own hand. If he actually wrote the letter himself, then that wouldn't make a lot of sense. Possibly he could have used a secretary, but I think the fact that Timothy probably penned it or put it together also makes sense. Paul said, hey, I'm signing off on this. It's not just Timothy. But so there's not a lot of theology that you find in verses 7 through the end. You get a little bit in verse 2 through 6, sort of pulling some things together, some general statements towards the end. But most of the, the walk in wisdom towards outsiders, make the best use of your time. It's about having a good witness towards people on the outside. Most of theology finishes with chapter 4, verse 1. You get the how to live in chapter 3. You get your case study of the household code that finishes in 4:1. Then you have a few final remarks and then the closing greetings. And mostly by this point, he's finishing up and concluding.
Mm-hmm. So now, if you had been preaching a sermon or a sermon series and you got to this point, what do you think are the big ideas that we should walk away from?
Well, there's a few things. You need to understand, let me put it this way. There's a theology, there's the practical living, and those are the two big parts of the letter. And then there's a connection between them. And it's not just like, okay, yeah, Christ is, who he is, and that's great and everything, but here's these things that you need to do to live. No, they're actually connected. And the actions flow from the theology. So you need to understand the main theological ideas, and then you need to understand how those translate into the actual things that you're supposed to do from day to day. And I think that's really what you need to walk away with is, understand each of those things in their entirety. Like, so spend some time looking at the hymns, spend some time looking at the theology. Also spend some time going back and looking at at what you're supposed to do. And there's a lot in there. You find that, give you another example on how the theology ties in. The chief moral virtue that's being given here is, it's called love. I would argue that a better translation would be selflessness, because the way we mean love today is just a romantic or emotional feeling, and that's not accurate. But selflessness, and Paul describes it further as, the opposite, the selfishness. He describes it as idolatry, when people focus on themselves. And here you have your connection back with the theology again. It's because Christ belongs at the center, not you. And so because Christ belongs at the center, if you put yourself first rather than him, then you are committing idolatry and you're making yourself your own God. And since you don't belong there because you're not the image of the invisible God, you're not the creator of all things, then you've got things messed up. So the theology works itself all the way into how you are actually supposed to live. And I think you need to understand both the theology and the living as their own things, but the real thing to get is to how all of these things are connected.
Mm-hmm. I think this kind of brings us back full circle what we talked about at the beginning, because so many times in our church services, we have applications from the text, and the applications could be good and true. For the sake of argument, we can say they are, but it's like they're just floating in air. There's no place for them. There's no reason for them. Right. And that's a huge disconnect for people. And it makes it seem like all the text, all the whole point of the Bible is just where here's how you are supposed to live your life for you. I remember being in a Sunday school class in my 20s and having a teacher say the book of Joshua was written so Israel would know to obey God. And I'm sure Joshua wanted them to do that, but I think there might be a little bit more to the book than that.
Yeah, it's glad you brought that up. I want to bring up another point that we didn't talk about. There's actually a reason given in this letter for why you would want to actually live the life God wants you to give. I think a lot of people ask that question all the time. It's like, why would I want to bother with this? Like, God wants me to live this way. So what? I don't want to. Why would I want to do that? Well, Paul actually answers that question and explains why a person would want to follow life God tells them to. And the answer is thankfulness. And when you understand the theology, going back to theology and doctrine, you need to understand these things. When you actually understand what Christ has done for you, the only proper response is thankfulness. And that is the reason that he gives for why you would want to live a moral life, because you are thankful for what has been done on your behalf. And if you don't understand the theology, then you don't understand what Christ has done for you. You don't understand who he is. You don't understand what he sacrificed. And you don't understand what lengths he was willing to go through to help you out of your miserable situation. And if you don't understand the theology, then you can't be thankful. And if you can't be thankful, then you can't appreciate what God has done and want to actually, follow the direction that he's put in front of you. You won't want to follow the path that he's laid out for you. So you cannot live a good life because if you don't understand the theology, because thankfulness is based on understanding that theology. So you can't have the one without the other. And if you understand the theology, then you really should live the moral life. I mean, they're not, neither one is disconnected from the other. They're both connected.
Mm-hmm. I'm and just thinking about this over and over, and it's just really problematic because our churches seem to be so anti-theology. And I wonder if part of the reason for this could be that we've grown so familiar with Christianity here in the West, it no longer shocks us. It's like, well, yeah, Christ forgives us, love God, do good for your man. Yeah, that's it. But we all know that already. We don't really consider how revolutionary those ideas are.
Well, those particular ones, when just the very, very basic, back of the book, 2-paragraph summary, we've become familiar with that. But we're not familiar with it at any deeper level than that. And I think if people actually did understand a bit more, when you start to dig into things a bit more, you see how wide this world is that you just have no exposure to, then you do begin to have a bit more appreciation for things like that. And I think that's part of the problem, that we have no appreciation for it. And the other part is that it's become almost we have to get people to church because that's what they need so they can hear what they need to hear the good news.
It's the pastor's job.
Yeah, and so it's the pastor's job. It's not your job, and that's, I argue, completely backwards. Churches are not meant to be a place to bring people in. They're made to be a place to send people out. They're meant to be more like a barracks. They're supposed to be a training ground to create people to send out. But that's a whole other conversation.
If we properly dress for church, we come in wearing combat gear.
Yeah. And it's just, and so things are done to do whatever they can things are done to make sure that we can get people to church, and everything is focused on how do we get people in the church. And the problem is that you've actually affected what happens when you're there, just so that people will come. And so things get watered down and watered down and watered down. And then you don't really have anything of significance anymore. Then people actually start to think that that's what Christianity is. And you wonder why Christianity doesn't shock them anymore. It's because what you mean when you say Christianity and what they mean when they say Christianity are very different things.
I'm not sure if you know this, but the reason my ministry here is called Deeper Waters, and my wife thinks it's so funny because I'm actually terrified of water. But what it is that, if you go to the ocean, you can walk in the shallow part and you can find some enjoyment in such a that. But if you could go out further and deeper, you would find there's so much more to that world than you could have ever thought to begin with. I mean, I think we've gone further out into space, but we have further into the ocean.
Yeah, it's just not that explored. And unfortunately, I think that's an appropriate metaphor because Christianity and real faith is something that's very infrequently explored.
I'm also curious, if way with churches, have you, one of the past books I've read recently is a book by David Murrow, Why Men Hate Going to Church. And I remember thinking, this is just so accurate about what the church has become. Are you familiar with that?
I'm not familiar with that, but Church and I don't get along very well, so I definitely appreciate the idea, at least communicated by the title.
And you should check it out. But I agree with you entirely. I don't know how many church services I've been in. Instead, I've got my phone out and such and trying to read something else that I think is interesting because it's kind of been here, done that. Can you give me something very substantial I can chew on here?
Yeah, I definitely understand.
So what do you think listeners of this show need to be doing then?
As far as which part? As far as the discussion on Colossians, as far as church, is changing the church? That is a very large question that what I've been trying to do with this particular research project is try to understand what Christianity actually is. Like my gut tells me there's something very, very wrong with it. But in order for me to not just remake Christianity in my own image and try to say this is what I think it needs to be like, I'm trying to go back and understand from the very beginning, what is it supposed to be? And that's why I did a PhD, so I could actually understand what it's supposed to be, so I can do the research and get answers. So I think I'm with this, I've been able to understand a little bit what is Christianity at its essence, and we'll be putting that in. I'm talking about a podcast now. I'll be putting it in book form in the next few years. The next major question that I really want to address is getting into the question of church and what it's supposed to be. And so I can't answer that yet. I would like to be able to, but I think as far as like a gut feeling right now, something is going to have to change in the way that we're doing church. The model right now, as we've been talking about, has been about bringing people in, it's about meeting their needs, it's about making people happy, and frankly, getting the numbers up. It was used, I think, as a means to an end, and that, I mean, I understand why people would do that, but we've wandered a long way away from what it's supposed to be. And in order for that to get fixed, individuals are going to have to start actually taking their own faith seriously as individuals. And that, I think, is probably going to be step one. Now, what that looks like when you actually come together, I don't know yet. I wish I had an answer for you right now. I don't. A little ways down the road, 5 or 10 years, hopefully I'll have an answer for that. But I think it needs to start by individuals taking their faith seriously. And then we can start getting onto the question of what does it mean to take our faith seriously as a group.
Now, just to clarify, you said that you get in your gut there's something wrong with Christianity. You don't mean Christianity as in the biblical sense, but Christianity as we do it today, right?
Right. I mean like modern American Western Christianity. I don't mean the biblical sense. I do think that, I go back to the beginning. It's like, I do believe God exists. I believe that Jesus died and rose from the dead bodily. And these things, and Christianity is actually true. But how we conceive Christianity as modern Americans is a little off. But what is it supposed to be? And I don't have an answer for that, or at least I think I have a bit of an answer for the Christianity part, and I think we're working towards that with what I found in Colossians. But I don't have an answer for the church question yet. But yeah, so I meant criticism of our version of Christianity, not the actual real Christianity.
Yeah, I just want to make sure I didn't want some atheists jumping out later on and saying, hey, look, Matt Delockery says there's something wrong with Christianity in his gut. And
no, I appreciate you saving me from that unfavorable soundbite.
Yeah. Now, and you and I are in the same boat. I'm trying to figure out what's wrong with the problem as well and such, what it is and how we can fix it. But unfortunately, that's going to have to be a discussion for another podcast because we've reached our time limit here. Now, do you have a blog, a website, an email way people can get in touch if they want to find out more?
Yeah, you can find out more about what I do at mattdelockery.com. It's MattDelockery. I podcast regularly, blog occasionally, and I also have a Facebook page, Twitter. You can find me at Matt Delockery on Twitter, and just Facebook.com/Matt Delockery as well. So there's links to all of those on my website if you if you want to get in touch with me that way.
Mm-hmm. And do you have any final words you'd like to leave today for the Deeper Waters audience?
I just appreciate you having me on and giving me the chance to be able to share a little bit about Colossians and sort of the essence of Christianity.
Well, it was great having you on, and I hope we'll see you back here again sometime.
Hope to be back.
And like to remind everyone, if you're here next week, you're going to be disappointed because I'm going to be at the Mention of Ours conference. But the week after that, you're supposed to have Dr. Ken Stewart on, talking about his book, In Search of Ancient Roots. Does Protestantism have a heritage to it or not? For now, I am Nick Peters, and I am signing off.